KRISH.
Thank you. Right, good evening. So, sometime in 2012, a Chinese blogger called Mr. Fossey wrote an open letter to the Pitchfork music magazine. Pitchfork is a very influential online music magazine. It has a lot of clout in the industry, and it's a big deal for bands to get covered, and it has a very diverse global readership. So, Mr. Fossey's point was very simple. He just asked Pitchfork, if Asia is going to become a dominant economic and cultural superpower, where are the Asian bands? How does it make any sense for a site like Pitchfork not to feature any bands from Karachi and Seoul and Shanghai and Yangon? And how could they not be of interest to a publication like Pitchfork, right? And I sort of realized this myself last year because I found out that all my favorite bands are from Asia, but none of them had heard of each other. So my favorite Indonesian band had never heard of my favorite Indian band, which had never heard of my favorite Chinese band, even though the connections between them were so clear in my own head. And the reason this is so is because we don't have a sense of regional consciousness. We don't think of Asia as an integrated music market. So when bands become big in their own countries in Asia, like in China or India, the next logical step for them is the US or Europe. It's not other countries in the region. And because of this, there's hardly any sort of cross-fertilization of ideas between bands in this region, right? So here's my argument. I'm saying, let's build an audience. Let's build an audience that can appreciate the connections between countries in Asia and the independent music that they produce, right? That can draw these connections between Indonesia and Mongolia and Sri Lanka and Japan, right? Before we ask Pitchfork to recognize Asian music, let's recognize it ourselves. And the reason we should do this is because, well, this music is awesome. And we're not doing justice to the creativity of these bands by talking about them in Western categories. I mean, you see this a lot in reviews of Asian music. They're like a Malaysian Arcade Fire, Filipino Radiohead. And I'm saying, let's advocate for a new language. Let's start thinking about issues like, how does a band like Karsik Cars represent modern Beijing? How does a group like Shire and Funk represent modern Mumbai? What can they tell us about these societies in transition? And how can we situate these bands' music within their own local contexts? And when you start doing this, you start finding out some really interesting things. You start realizing that it's impossible to talk about modern history and society of these countries without mentioning these bands. So if you want to understand modern China, you have to listen to the music of Cui Jian. And if you want to understand modern India, you have to listen to Word, Sound and Power by Bant Singh. And the reason is that these bands are telling stories. They're telling narratives about where our societies stand today. Let me just tell you about one band called Residence A in Beijing. The singer here lost his index finger in an industrial accident. And then he learned to play the guitar upside down till he could get enough money to buy a left-handed guitar. And they're one of the hottest bands in Beijing today. And the reason I mention this story is because these bands, in so many ways, are the voice of our generation. They're holding up a mirror to our societies, which are not very clearly defined yet. And they're really telling us what our deepest, darkest fears and hopes and aspirations are. And we need to start listening to these voices. Now, I'm a student of public policy in Singapore, and the way I think of issues, I think of policy recommendations. So I want to break this down to how can we make this happen? How can we start drawing connections between musical bands in different countries in Asia so that they start cross-fertilizing ideas and start collaborating with each other? I have a few sort of speculative ideas on how to make this happen. But before we do that, I want to just say that this is not my original idea. A lot of great people are already working on this. We don't have a Pitchfork equivalent in Asia that has clout in the music industry, but we do have some great regional blogs, such as Other Sounds and N7. And we have companies like Tenzin Men, which introduce bands from one part of Asia to bands in other parts of Asia. These guys are awesome. Please do check them out. So my first idea is what I call ambient awareness, which is let's put this music out there where it doesn't belong. Put it in background music in restaurants. Put it as background music in shops. Put it in TV commercials. Put it in soap operas. Don't force it down people's throat, but just sneak it in where it doesn't belong right now so people get an awareness of these noises, in the background. And then you can start disaggregating them. Let's build an app like Pandora where I put in the name of my favorite band in Beijing and it throws out a name of my favorite band in India. And then you can start discovering bands from around the region. And we can do this once we start disaggregating these genres, once we start talking about what makes Bangalorean music similar to music from Jogja. And we start finding these really interesting connections. And I would absolutely love to see an established touring route across Asia, the way that exists in Europe, and in the US. Let's create regular annual opportunities for bands to travel across Asia. Let's put Taiwanese bands in Pakistan. Let's put Pakistani bands in Ulaanbaatar. And once you do that, the possibilities of collaboration really expand. And it's up to us as audiences to start engaging with this music more seriously. Let's get geeky about this, write wikis, write blog posts, like pressure your local journalists like myself to write about this for mainstream newspapers. Let's get the word out there that there's this great music scene that exists that deserves to be recognized. And I want to talk briefly about the role that Singapore can play in this. Singapore as a port city has always been a crossroads for cultures. And in the 60s, Singapore was the incubator for regional bands. This was where bands from Indonesia and Malaysia came to make it big, because this was where all the business opportunities were, and this is where all the high-end studios and the record executives sat. And Singapore can be the hub for this new musical Silk Route that I'm describing, where bands can come here to find niche audiences, new opportunities for collaboration, and new audiences. So let Singapore be a sort of clearinghouse for all these new sounds that are going to emerge from out of Asia. So that's essentially my pitch. All I'm saying is that we need to start paying attention to this remarkable body of music coming out of Asia and treat it in Asian terms. Because remember, for most of these bands, they're not doing this for money. There's no money in this. They're doing this out of sheer love for their music and the desire to engage with their audiences. They don't have hipster blessings or mainstream media coverage or arts grants. And what they do, they always do purely for the music. And it's time we start appreciating that. Thank you.